One of the perennial criticisms leveled against Christianity in modern secular society is that it is somehow nothing more than a crutch for the weak. Such is a charge regarded by those who make it as so damning and so conclusive that they rarely even bother to explain exactly what they mean by it. But my own response to this statement has always been simple enough. Of course it is. Of course it is. Of course faith in Jesus Christ is for the weak. Because as any truly mature and faithful person will readily tell you, it's only by acknowledging our weakness before God that we can become genuinely strong. Now, I acknowledge this isn't actually what most people mean when they call Christian faith a crutch. Rather, what they're really suggesting is that such faith is a delusional comfort, a comfort for those who somehow cannot bear to look the real world in the eye, and who instead prefer to retreat into a world of escapism and sentimentality. By this logic, Christian faith is a crutch for the weak, because such people resort to telling themselves lies in order to make it through the grim and unforgiving experience of human life. So by the same logic, it appears that what makes someone strong rather than weak is the capacity to compete in a cruel world on its own terms. But it seems clear enough, to me at least, that when Christians are faced with the accusation of being too weak for this world, the very last thing we ought to do is answer the charge on its own terms. For to do so is to abandon our God-given wisdom before we even have properly got started. Instead, we should answer the charge by insisting that the very ideas, the very concepts of strength and weakness, these ought to be held up to close moral scrutiny. What then does it actually mean to be strong? Or, for that matter, what does it mean to be weak? And why should the rest of us defer uncritically to those who possess the darkest and most cynical view of things when we make these distinctions? In short, why should we as Christians ever be ashamed? Ashamed of placing our hope and our faith not in ourselves, but in the power of the living God. Both our text from the Old Testament and from the Gospel this morning, they make for great stories, the kind I expect most of us will associate with our early days in Sunday school. In the first book of Samuel, we encounter the future King David and his slingshot, defeating the giant Goliath against all odds. While in the Gospel, we see Jesus miraculously calming the storm and saving his terrified disciples. And what makes these stories so memorable, of course, is the very clear and dramatic way in which both David and Jesus confound expectation, and in the process of doing so, demonstrate the nature of God's saving power. Yet in both cases also, it seems, the essence of the story is not actually to be found. It's not to be found in the moment that most of us best remember. And so David's confrontation with Goliath only comes at the very end of the episode of which it forms a part. And the dramatic action is resolved in just one verse. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. The rest of the story is actually about David's relationship with King Saul and the fundamental differences that exist between the two of them. As the ruler of Israel, up to this point, Saul has been a bold and capable warrior, but he's also someone who has gradually been corrupted by his own appetite for power. And so in the process, he's lost his way with God and can only see the world through the lens of human strength and human weakness. Which is why he's so frightened now of Goliath, the enemy who epitomizes the strength in which Saul has placed all his faith and all his understanding. It's a sign of Saul's own desperation, then, that he eventually even allows David, who's still just a boy after all, to be the champion to face up to Goliath. And at this precise moment in the story, there are some details we shouldn't overlook, because they capture the real message of the story much better than the famous bit later on about the slingshot. For having given David leave to face Goliath, Saul then clothes David in his own armor, his bronze helmet and his coat of mail. But David, we read, tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. Saul here assumes that the only way David can possibly succeed is if he emulates Saul's own example and abides by the logic of human strength and human weakness that Saul himself has come to live by. But David instinctively knows that this is wrong for him, that it contradicts the essence of who he is and how he sees the world. And so he would prefer to be weak, or perhaps it would be better to say vulnerable, when he finally goes up in battle against Goliath. By this way of reading, then, the 5 smooth stones and slingshot become symbols, not primarily of David's cleverness or even his underdog status, but of his own deep faith amidst vulnerability. God has made him this way, and David is not afraid to be faithful to his calling, even in the face of worldly dangers that terrify men twice his size. In this, the actual defeat of Goliath is almost an afterthought. The real turning point in the story is when David boldly refuses the armor that Saul has given him as protection from the things Saul himself is too afraid to face. In exactly the same way, I suggest to you this morning that the story of Jesus calming the storm isn't really about the storm at all. Rather, it's about the dynamic that exists inside the boat between Jesus and his disciples. As with the David and Goliath episode, here again, there are apparently minor details that we would actually do well not to take for granted or to overlook. It's important, for example, that when Jesus tells the disciples he wants to cross the Sea of Galilee, we're told, quote, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. But what does it mean to say, just as he was? What is the gospel trying to tell us with this seemingly unnecessary and extraneous comment? Could it, after all, be a pointer towards what really matters here? That Jesus is entering the boat without defense or preparation for what's about to happen. The next detail seems to confirm this interpretation. When the storm blows up and begins to swamp the boat, Jesus, we're told, was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. Could there, in fact, be a more evocative image of trust and vulnerability than one such as this? Just as he is, Jesus sleeps through the storm, exposed and unafraid and untroubled by what's going on around him. It's only when confronted by his terrified disciples that Jesus performs the miracle which in turn makes the story memorable to most of us. Yet as in the case of David slaying Goliath, the calming of the storm itself is only a reflection of a deeper and subtler point. And that, of course, is the challenge that Jesus offers to his disciples. The challenge to recognize that their capacity to face up to life's hardships and dangers, it's inextricably linked to their willingness to make themselves vulnerable. and to live by a radical trust in the love and care of God. And so after Jesus has calmed the storm, he asks the disciples, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" Before we too readily find fault here with the disciples, we would do well, I think, to recognize just how hard it is to make ourselves vulnerable in the way God is asking us to do. The urge to be as strong and pragmatic as we can be in the face of life's realities, surely this is comprehensible to nearly all of us. When life gets hard, who doesn't feel the impulse to put on as much armor as possible, or to make a careful plan for saving the boat from being swamped by the waves? To want to protect ourselves from danger and from suffering is the most natural thing in the world. But as human beings who are also followers of Jesus, we're called to play by a different set of rules. We're called to understand our capacity for vulnerability, for weakness, as the basis for a different kind of strength. Which is why I began the sermon today by saying, yes, of course Christianity is a crutch for the weak. Because it's the means by which we recognize that in and through our weakness, God makes us strong in terms the world cannot even begin to fathom. For in our willingness to be vulnerable, we are set free in our weakness, free to face the world without fear. Now, having said all this, I appreciate some of you may still find all this just a little too idealistic. It's all very well for the vicar to speak this way up in the pulpit. You still have responsibilities to fulfill and other people to think of. That's true, and I understand it. I absolutely understand it. But it's also true that at the end of the day, each of us has a choice to make. Will we be Saul, or will we be David? Will we pass our time on this earth trusting God to bear us through the storm, or will we lurch about in a fever of constant anxiety and mistrust? This is the choice. And this is our faith, not just to accept, but in fact to celebrate our weakness, that we in turn may rejoice. Rejoice in the strength and the power of the living and the loving God.